So, I am Chuck Liddell. This is the library. We're on Catalina Island. Today is June 12th, 2024, and I'm going to be lecturing about the Chicago Cubs. Now, as we always do, just so I know that we have them recorded, which you can then watch at your leisure, because they are now on a blog or whatever you call them. I'm not good on terms, but they have a way, and you can ask him where to find them, and you can see all my other lectures. So you can then, anywhere in the world, you can bring it up and whatever. So, as is my purpose, I am going to try to bring up things that are not in the history books. These are things that I was personally involved in. So that's the reason I'm doing what I'm going to do at the beginning, and then we'll open up to whatever you have questions about. Okay, to begin with, you have probably, the Chicago Cubs had their spring training here from 1921 to 1951. Now, why would they have the Chicago Cubs over here? Well, if you know a little bit about it, Mr. Wrigley had purchased the island in 1919 from the Banning brothers. He owned the Chicago Cubs. Now, Mr. Wrigley had always said he had three loves in his life. It wasn't the gum company. That was just a way to make money. His three loves in this order was his family, good, Catalina Island, and the Chicago Cubs. Well, he spent a lot of his time in Pasadena on Orange Grove Boulevard. That's where they moved out in 1916. And of course, he still had his place in Lake Geneva in Wisconsin, the Midwest. I kind of think he wanted to get to nicer weather. I mean, in February and March, the weather's not that great in the Midwest, especially in Wisconsin. So I kind of think Mr. Wrigley said, look, I want to have the whole enchilada. They didn't say that in those days. I want to have my family here. I want to be on Catalina, and I want to get my Cubs here. So he had them coming out every year for their spring training here on Catalina Island. Again, they were looking at snow, and here we had, pretty nice weather. So that is primarily the reason why he did this, to get all three elements here. Now, things went along pretty well until World War II. Okay, the island, as I told you before, was completely cut off from the mainland because of the fear of the Japanese Navy and submarines taking over the island and then destroying the oil refineries. So everything was cut off here, which meant the Chicago Cubs wouldn't come, obviously, because there's nothing going on here, and they would not be allowed to come here because the island was shut down. Don't forget, by this time, it was the second Mr. Wrigley. The original William Wrigley Jr., whose mansion is up in the hill, died in 1932. His son, Philip Knight Wrigley, then took over. So we're now talking about the second generation, Philip Knight, P.K. Wrigley, which he hated the name, but I'll make it easy, P.K. Wrigley. And his wife, the reason they call that the Atwater Hotel, some people think it's because of the location to the ocean. It's not. His wife's name was Helen Atwater. That was her maiden name. So it was Helen Atwater Wrigley. So anyway, I'm throwing a bunch of, I always do this, I go off on tangent. You love that look on her face. She said, I know what you're talking about.
I'm thinking about the Atwater before it was the Atwater now.
Yeah, the old Atwater, okay. Well, anyway, so now Lolo, don't bother him with this. I'll try to get a copy, so don't bother him. He's only going to be 95 in July. He's still our barber, except he doesn't go to get his hair cut.
No, Lolo.
He shaves you real good.
And his was no Lolo. That's what he said to me.
I love Lolo, though. Don't make the mistake.
So
but not
anyway,
for my hair.
Mr. Wrigley, P.K. Wrigley, was Mr. Conservative. At that time, you know, the president, Roosevelt, F.D. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was Mr. Liberal. So Mr. Wrigley had a brilliant idea, and he wrote to the president, and he said, President Roosevelt, I have an idea. Why don't we exempt all of the military, all of the baseball players from being drafted into the military? Because, well, his reasoning was kind of good. He said, because we have to keep up the morale in the country, and baseball is the national sport. So his rationale was good, but of course, the fact that he also owned a baseball team, I kind of think he had kind of an ulterior motive. Well, I've seen the copy of the letter. Lolo has it, but please don't bother. I'll try to get it for one of our other lectures. He has the response from President Roosevelt to Mr. Wrigley, very tactfully saying, you've got to be out of your frickin' mind. He said, you realize what this would do to our country with all of our young men as part of the draft. They had instigated the draft for the first time for a long time. He said, you realize what this would do to morale in the country if they knew that just to be a baseball player, you didn't have to go into the military. Okay, so Mr. Wrigley was now, what do we do now, right? What do we do now? Well, okay, if you ever saw the movie A League of Their Own, okay, that is telling the story about the all-girls professional softball team. They are telling the story about A League of Their Own. Okay, if you see the movie, they refer to the man who came up with the idea as a fudge magnet. F-U-D-G-E. It was a gum magnet. It was Mr. Wrigley. And they came up with his vice president, I forgot what name they used, as the man who came up with the idea of let's get an all-women's softball team. Well, it wasn't, you know, they couldn't use, I guess they couldn't use the real name. The man who came up with Arthur Meyerhoff, he was the Wrigley marketing director and advertiser for Wrigley Gum. He had an office right next to Lolo's for years. I knew Mr. Meyerhoff. He's the one that came up with this idea. So now they started the all-women's professional baseball, I think they called it the all-girls professional softball team, I think is the official name. Okay, A League of Their Own was started by Mr. Wrigley and Arthur Meyerhoff. Okay, I don't think they have that in the history books. Okay, now I'm going to tell you something that happened. This was kind of funny. A man by the name of Jim Vitti, and I think you have the book here. I think it's called Cubs on Catalina Island. It tells about the history of the Cubs being here. And for the book signing, which was about, I think, 15 years ago, I mean, they'll have it in there when it was written, I think it was 15, 20 years ago. I got a call from Jim Vitti from Atlanta, Georgia. I was greeting the boat at that time. I was the official greeter for Catalina. And so I was standing out there, phone rings. He said, this is Jim Vitti. I had no idea who Jim Vitti was. And he said, I want to introduce myself. I'm writing a book on the history of the Chicago Cubs on Catalina Island. And I think you can help me. I said, who recommended this? He said, Blaney, Wrigley, Haganah, what's her last name now? It's the name of the museum. Is that horrible? Okay. Anyway, okay, so anyway, you can see the name of her up there on the museum. So she was alive, of course, at the time. So I said, was she joking? And he said, no. Why would you think he was joking? I said, do you know how old I am? He said, no. I said, you know how old I am when the Chicago Cubs stopped playing here? He said, no. I said, I was 4 years old.
Wow.
What would I know? I know I went to the games because my father worked for Mr. Wrigley, but I'm sorry, I can't give you anything. And he said, well, I think you can. And I said, well, what can I help you with? He said, you know most of the women here on Catalina, you know most of the people here on Catalina. I said, yes, I do. He said, the trouble with my book, I want to get into the story of what went on under the bleachers during the games.
Oh dear.
I said, under the bleachers? And I finally snapped and I said, oh, you want to know about that went on under the bleachers with the players? And he said, yes. I said, tell me who you have, that you've contacted to give you information. And he named about 7 men. I said, that's your problem. They are baseball fans. What they know is baseball. You need to talk to the women who are under the bleachers with the players. He said, do you happen to know who they are? And I said, yes. He said, will you give me their names? I said, okay, I will give you their names. But you have to explain why you're calling. You have to mention my name because they're probably going to clam up. They're not going to, because they weren't supposed to be fraternizing with the players. I mean, this was not done. So I said, I will give you their names, but I can't guarantee that they are going to admit to it because I know from my father who they are. One of them used to work for my father. She was his secretary. So Blanche Hamlin, or anyway, I can't remember. So anyway, he calls me back about 2 weeks later. He said, you were a godsend. I said, I forgot, I said, what did I do? He said, the women confessed to it. I got 3 women to confess to what they did with the Chicago Cubs. And they told me, I guess, basically what they did. So what they did is they got all of the ex-Chicago Cub players to come here and actually throw the ball. Where it was, in case you don't know, is a place we now call Field of Dreams. So in those days, the whole area, the city hall wasn't there, the fire department wasn't there, nothing was there. So Mr. Wrigley duplicated the Wrigley Field, the dimensions, so that the players would have a better chance to practice. So that whole area going all the way up to Avalon Canyon Road was all the Wrigley playing field. Okay, so they have just a little bit area left. There's a fence around it. You look in, they have a bunch of machinery, or they have a bunch of tanks, or not tanks, but trucks. So that is all that's left. Where the bleachers were was up in the canyon where the eucalyptus trees are. And where the teams were, there is a wall separating the Field of Dreams to the golf course. That's when you see pictures of them sitting. They didn't have any dugouts. The teams just sat on the wall. And who they played, Mr. Wrigley had what he called farm teams. These were teams on the mainland that basically were working young men to learn how to be better players so they could then bring them on. They also had professional teams over on the mainland. So, and they also had, I don't think you call it intervarsity, they call that at school, but they would be able to play themselves. Now, Mr. Wrigley used to live up at the Wrigley Mansion. It's called the Indiana Mount Ada now. So his room was on this side looking down at the Wrigley Field. He had binoculars, well, I shouldn't say binoculars, he had a telescope and he had a phone. So he would watch the teams playing and he would call the manager and tell him, I'm happy, or, I want to, okay. If the team wasn't playing well enough, he would call the manager and said, I want to see the boys. That meant that those poor young men had to run all the way from the Wrigley Field, all the way up that road, which is pretty steep. They would cut to the entrance to the Wrigley Mansion. If you've been there, you know there are about 150 stairs. He would stand at the top of the stairs. They would have to run all the way, run up the 150 steps. He would then shake their hands, smile at them. They would turn around and run all the way back. That was his way of letting them know, don't do this again. So I think they only did it once or twice. So I think those are all the stories that I'm going to tell that we can't find in the history book. So when we're done, I think we're probably done. I'll answer any more questions about them or any other questions you have.